Barbara Russano Hanning, and this is the 5th edition of this book. So, I'm going to begin with the ancient and medieval worlds. It's the part 1. So, please read the description as well of this video. Okay, I'll start now. From the beginning of human existence, singing has been a natural outlet for the expression of feelings. Probably even before the development of language, the utterances of the human voice gave vent to basic emotions, the wails of lament, the howls of pain, the giggles of joy, the quavering of fear. Once combined with language, singing became a powerful means of communicating not only generalized feelings, but also the most personal and subtle sentiments. By heightening and coloring the words, the singing voice can render their meaning with a force greater than they have when merely spoken. In fact, vocal music dominates the first 2 parts of our history, antiquity through the Renaissance, but not because that is all there was. Rather, it constitutes most of what survives in written form, and that music, in turn, is almost exclusively a product of the elite and literate classes of society, and only a tiny fraction of all the music that was made through the centuries. Nevertheless, since the advent of recorded history, attitudes towards singing have reflected the cultural and intellectual concerns peculiar to a given time and place. For example, the ancient Greeks stressed vocal music over instrumental music because they expected a distinctive character, ethos, from their arts that only words could impart to music. All ancient Christian music was vocal, but during the Middle Ages, some church leaders were troubled by the sensuality of the voice in the performance of religious plain song or chant, and expressed concern about the potential distractions of songs as an aid to worship. In the court cultures of 16th century Italy, the art of singing was particularly significant. Not only was it a marker for grace and nobility, but it was also believed to be the link that connected us to the entire cosmos, putting the individual in touch with the harmony of the universe. Despite the lack of surviving musical pieces, scholars believe that the repertoires of the ancient Near East, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and other civilizations between the Mediterranean Sea, I cannot say that word, and the Persian Gulf, were not very different from ours today. Wedding songs, funeral dirges, military marches, work songs, nursery songs, dance music, tavern songs, banquet music, devotional and ceremony music, and stories sung to instrumental accompaniment, all functioning to comfort, edify, amuse, and celebrate. Although we can postulate a vibrant musical life without actual music to perform, it remains almost entirely silent. Ancient Greece is the earliest civilization that offers us enough evidence to construct a well-rounded view of musical culture. From the myth of Orpheus, who overturned the laws of nature with his singing, we understand the power with which music was invested. In real life, the Greeks used musical magic to heal the body as well as the soul. Carefully chosen melodies could banish illness and restore order in society. Not for nothing did Plato, in the 4th century before Common Era, BCE, recommend that the ideal state be founded on suitable types of music and warn against the unsettling effects of musical innervation. Citizens of Sparta were alarmed when the contemporary musician Timotheus performed with 4 additional strings on his lyre, and the court ordered that they be snipped off. Lawlessness in art could lead to anarchy in society. During the 1st millennium BCE, Rome rose from an insignificant settlement on the banks of the Tiber, or Tiber, to perhaps the most successful empire in the world. Around that time, Plato wrote his Republic, the actual Republic of Rome, governed by a patrician or aristocratic class, was thriving on the Italian peninsula and absorbing many aspects of Greek culture. By the end of the 1st century Common Era, Roman armies had conquered Greece and held sway over the entire Mediterranean world and Western Europe, from to Spain in the west, and from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south. The musical culture they brought with them was basically that of the Greeks, which helps to explain why Greek theories became so pervasive and exerted so much influence on the various types of music and musical eras we study in this book. Now, next paragraph is called Overview of the Early Middle Ages. Greek musical thought influenced medieval church music and music theory as it was transmitted to the West by Boethius, the most revered authority on music in the Middle Ages. This period in history reckoned from the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the West during the 4th and 5th centuries to the middle of the 15th century, overlapping with the early Renaissance, saw the spread of the new religion, Christianity, and the establishment of many of the ideas and institutions of Western civilization, such as the university, trade guilds, and certain legal principles such as trial by jury. The term Middle Ages acknowledges the era's position in time between the ancient and modern worlds, or between the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome and the emergence of the new humanistic culture of the Renaissance. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Christianity remained the strongest unifying force in medieval Europe. The papacy, or papacy, not sure how to pronounce that, gradually gained secular authority. Monastic communities, mostly following the rules of Saint Benedict, preserved classical learning, and missionaries sent to convert Germanic and other tribes spread Latin civilization far and wide, including what became the first literate repertory of song, Gregorian chant. As with music in any age, medieval music was shaped by currents in the larger society. Its history is particularly intertwined with the history of the Christian Church, the dominant social institution for most of the Middle Ages. The Church was very much part of the world, and the relationship between Church and world, or between ecclesiastical and secular leadership, advanced the causes of both sides. In the 8th century, Carolingian rulers made a concerted effort to create a new world order in which church and king worked together. This alliance was cemented in the year 800 when Charlemagne, ruler of the Frankish lands, went to Rome to be crowned emperor by the Pope, therefore becoming the temporal ruler of the newly reconstituted Western Roman Empire, anointed by the spiritual ruler of Western Christendom. One result of this political maneuver was the importation across the Alps from Italy of Roman chant, along with Roman art, architecture, as well as manuscript production and illumination. Thus was Gregorian chant imposed on the Christian liturgy throughout the Frankish lands. Its repertory subsequently became stabilized and eventually singled out for preservation in written form. Many aspects of Western music, from notation to polyphony, originated in church music. Those who were educated at all were educated in schools established by the church, and most composers and theorists were trained there. We can study medieval church music today only because, unlike some other repertories, it survived. And it survived, the product of a very small number of people of wealth, leisure, and literacy in the largest monasteries and cathedrals. Only because church musicians invented notation sometime during the 9th century, and followed it with a series of innovations in musical notation that enabled song to be written down with increasing accuracy. In the political arena, 3 principal successors to the Roman Empire had emerged by the 9th century. The most direct successor was the Byzantine Empire in Asia Minor and southeastern Europe. The strongest and most vibrant was the Arab world, which, from the founding of Islam early in the 7th century by Muhammad, rapidly expanded to dominate a vast territory from modern-day Pakistan through the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. The weakest, poorest, and most fragmented of the 3 was Western Europe. In this context, Charlemagne's coronation in 1800 as emperor in Rome asserted to the world a continuity with the Roman past, independence from the Byzantine East, and the promise of a unified civilization in Western Europe. Water break. European culture owes much to all three empires. The Byzantines preserved Greek and Roman science, architecture, and culture. Most writings that survive from ancient Greece exist only because Byzantine scribes copied them. The Arabs extended Greek philosophy and science, fostered trade and industry, and contributed to medicine, chemistry, technology, and mathematics. Arab rulers were patrons of literature, architecture, and other arts. Charlemagne, as ruler of the Frankish kingdom and, after 800, a Holy Roman Empire, also promoted learning and artistic achievement. He improved education, encouraging primary schools in monasteries and cathedral towns throughout this realm. By sponsoring scholarship and the arts, Charlemagne and his son Louis I, the Pious, made their courts into centers for intellectual and cultural life, setting a pattern for Western rulers that endured for 1,000 years. Next paragraph, political change and economic development. After Louis's death, his empire was divided. Over the next few centuries, the modern European nations began to emerge, although their boundaries changed frequently. The western part of the empire became France. Until about 1200, the French king was relatively weak, directly ruling only the area around Paris, while other regions were governed by nobles who owned nominal allegiance to the king but often acted independently. Their courts provided opportunities for poets and musicians, nurturing the troubadour and trouvère. In the eastern part of the empire, German kings claimed the title of emperor as Charlemagne's successors. The realm, eventually known as the Holy Roman Empire, included non-German lands, as well, from the Netherlands to northern Italy. The regional nobility in the empire competed for prestige by hiring the best singers, instrumentalists, and composers, which fueled development of music until the 19th century. Outside the former Frankish lands, a centralized kingdom emerged in England in the late 9th century and continued after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Italy remained fragmented among several rulers, including the Pope, and Spain was divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim lands in the south. The Crusades, a series of campaigns organized by both religious and secular leaders between 1095 and 1270 to retake Jerusalem from the Turks, ultimately failed, but showed the growing confidence and military power of Western Europe. These political developments were hand in hand with remarkable economic progress. Technological advances in agriculture and expansion of cultivated lands led to great growth in production. An increasing food supply raised the standard of living, allowed the population to triple between 1000 and 1300. From about 1050 on, water-powered mills and windmills provided mechanical power for milling grain, manufacturing goods, and other uses, further boosting productivity. By 1300, Western Europe had surpassed the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world in economic strength. The medieval economy was largely agricultural, and the population mostly rural. Under feudalism, the dominant political and economic system of the Middle Ages, society was organized into three broad classes, as shown in figure 1.5, which is the next page. The nobility and knights, who controlled the land and fought the wars. Priests, monks, and nuns, who studied and prayed. And peasants, the vast majority of the population, who worked the land and served the nobles. Peasants and serfs lived lives of oppression and drudgery, laboring from morning to night for the barest subsistence, which prompted occasional outbreaks of violent rebellion. By the 12th century, trade in food and other products promoted the growth of markets, towns, and cities, although the largest centers were still small in modern times. In 1300, Paris had about 200,000 residents, London about 70,000, and Venice, Milan, and Florence about 100,000 each. Music was enjoyed at all levels of society, but the nobility had the luxury of emphasizing its importance and preservation as a symbol of wealth, leisure, and status. composers at the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris in the early 13th century. Cathedral schools were established throughout Western and Central Europe, teaching future school officials Latin grammar, rhetoric, and music. After 1200, independent schools for laymen spread rapidly as well, fostering a more secular culture and a tremendous rise in literacy. Beginning in the 12th century, universities founded in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and other cities taught liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine. The study of Aristotle became more common and more popular as his works were translated from Greek and Arabic into Latin. But early in the 13th century, the teaching of Aristotle's books about natural science was forbidden at the University of Paris. In the 1240s, the scientist Roger Bacon, who wrote commentaries on several of Aristotle's books, became the first to lecture formally on the Greek philosophers' works at the university, defending and correcting them after they were condemned. As the concept of university education took hold, a new kind of critical thinking, known as scholasticism, emerged and dominated medieval universities from about 1100 to 1500. Scholastics, or schoolmen, developed a curriculum that attempted to reconcile the various authorities of Christian teaching, collectively known as the Church Fathers, with the classical philosophers of antiquity, especially Aristotle. Intellectuals within the church, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, articulated and defended orthodoxy by synthesizing Greek rationalism and Christian doctrine, thereby making new contributions to philosophy and theology. Writers in vernacular languages produced a new literature of knighthood and chivalry, in which courtly love was a major element. Courtly love literature presented a highly idealized image of love that contained elements common to all feudal relationships. The lover assumed a subordinate role to his beloved. He was her loyal vassal, and therefore subject to her will. Much of the poetry of courtly love was sung, forming, along with chant, one of the two great monophonic repertories of medieval song. Next paragraph is overview of the 14th century. In the 14th century, Western Europe's economy and population declined, ravaged by famine, war, and plague. Power struggles and scandals afflicted the church as a series of French popes maintained a splendid court in Avignon, notorious for luxury and corruption. Along with French cardinals, who functioned truly as princes of the church, they dispensed liberal patronage to musicians, artists, and scholars, among whom was the Italian poet Petrarch, whose lyrics were to inspire composers of polyphonic song 2 centuries after his death. The crisis of the papacy reached its climax in the Papal Schism, 1378 to 1417, during which there were 2 popes claiming legitimacy, one in Avignon and one in Rome, and for a while a third one in Pisa, with all of Europe being forced to take sides. The 100 Years' Wars from 1337 to 1453, actually a series of intermittent sieges, raids, and battles, was part of the long and bitter rivalry between England and France that has surfaced periodically from the 11th century until modern times. During its final phase, a French peasant girl, who later became known as Joan of Arc, obeying voices she claimed to have heard, led an army of several thousand French forces to drive the English from France's soil. Although her expedition was successful, she was eventually captured, tried for heresy, and still in her teens burned at the stake in 1431. What an icon. The worst period of famine Europe experienced during the Middle Ages occurred in the 14th century, from 1314 to 1317, when unusually heavy rains devastated crops and caused over 10% of the population to die of starvation. Later in the century, terrible epidemics of plague further decimated the population of cities like Florence so badly that they did not recover their numbers until the late 19th century. The resulting desire to understand thought and Christian beliefs. Wait a minute. I see now. There's like another part, but the next part here. So, the resulting desire to understand. Roman bishop, eventually. other by telling stories, the pilgrims so imaginatively brought to life by Geoffrey Chaucer in his masterpiece, Canterbury Tales, engage in the same pastime on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury, who was assassinated in the cathedral there in 1170. Italian artists like the sculptor Giovanni Pisano and the painter Giotto anticipated the Renaissance in their works by incorporating classical elements of symmetry and balance and depicting the human form with greater realism. The elite music of the late Middle Ages reflects many of these trends. A preoccupation with structure and pleasure in certain genres surfaced for the first time, perhaps partly as a response to the disorder in society. Composers in France and Italy extended the vernacular repertory of courtly love lyrics to the polyphonic realm, and the elaborate textures and rhythmic complications characteristic of the repertory at the end of the 14th century suggest the ostentatious pleasures of the court at Avignon. Polyphonic church music flourished, and not only in the cathedrals, as princes and patrons in every country supported musicians to write and perform music for their private chapels, both to adorn the liturgy and to foster a sense of their own importance. So I'm going to stop here for today, but I do hope you learned a thing or two and that you enjoyed just simply the sound of whispering, as that is actually my favorite kind of ASMR trigger. But I do want to continue this as like a kind of series, so let me know what you think in the comments. And next time we're going to read Chapter 1, Music in Ancient Greece and Early Christian Rome. Also, I had to carry a microphone